Hi everyone, it's Alex from Risk Academy, and today I'm talking to Gavin Pearce, the CRO of icare and the Risk Manager of the Year 2017 in Australia. Gavin, thank you so much for agreeing to have a chat with me to spend this time.
Yeah, welcome. Yeah, happy to have a chat, meet new people, talk about risk.
Absolutely, and for me it's an interesting conversation because I've been out of the country for probably more than 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up in Australia, I finished my risk degree in Australia, I worked as a risk manager here, but I've really been out for so long. What's been happening? What's the new kind of vibe in risk management in Australia?
Yeah, good question. So I've always worked in the insurance industry, so I can talk a lot about the insurance industry. And I guess in Australia, the Australian Prudential Regulatory Authority, or APRA, looks after the well-being of all the financial services institutions, including banks, insurance companies, superannuation schemes. They put out a professional standard CPS 220 a number of years ago, and that really called out the requirements of the risk management function in the financial services. One of the call-outs was that the company should have a CRO, that CRO should report directly to the CEO. And so what that meant was that it was raising the profile of risk management. It wasn't just somewhere that was 3 or 4 levels down in the organisation. They also called out that you should have a risk management strategy document, so actually thinking proactively about what you're doing. You need a risk appetite statement, a board-approved risk appetite statement that is actually something that's used by the organisation, so it's not just a piece of document that sits on the shelf. And they also called out in one of the sort of finer pieces that the board must form a view on the risk culture of the organisation. And I think that is where, over the last 4 or 5 years, certainly in the financial services space, that organisations are starting to think about, how do I describe my risk culture? How is that part of the overall culture of the organisation? How do I change the culture of the organisation from a risk management perspective? And I think that's where risk management is going, which to me is all about moving from just the processes and the systems and into that people space.
Yeah, that's very interesting. We will pick up on that. You've seen some of my work, and controversy is my second name. Since I believe, and it may be different from country to country, but normally I believe that regulators are usually the last kind of off the block. Many good risk managers have been doing stuff for years, well before the regulator does something. But that's interesting. I mean, if the regulators tell the companies that they should have an executive with the risk hat on, and certain documents have to happen, and the department have to be compiled, it then the onus is then on the risk manager to deliver. So getting the title of the CRO is now the easy part, but then proving to the CEO and the other executives that you are equal to them, that you have as much to contribute to the decisions that are being made at the executive meetings. How is that working out? I mean, do your risk managers, does your average risk manager have the necessary skills? Because I mean, until recently, they've probably been just doing the quarterly or the monthly or the 6-monthly risk register updates. That kind of doesn't sound sufficient to fulfill the executive role.
No, and I think that's where the challenge lies, is that how do you find or improve the quality of risk managers and move from that very operational focus into more of that sort of strategic focus, and to actually sit at the executive table and have a conversation around the strategy of the organisation, not just the risks associated with not achieving your objectives. So, I think there are a number of institutions that are trying to improve the quality of risk managers in Australia. I think there's still a long way to go, and from what I've seen across a number of industries, risk managers come from all different prior roles. So I've seen lawyers, I've seen accountants, general counsel, people who come from an engineering background, people who have more of a sort of workplace health and safety background. And I think I think for me, you've got to find those people that, a bit like yourself, happy to sort of challenge the status quo and be a little bit provocative and ask all the right questions, even if it means things get a little uncomfortable, and know a little bit about a lot of things around what's happening, not just in your own organisation, but, have an interest in what's happening in the broader industry that you work in and even the broader risk management fraternity. And I think those people that have that balance of the IQ and the EQ are the ones that generally seem to make the best risk managers.
Yeah. And you've alluded, thank you, and you've alluded to that one of the kind of directions that risk managers can take is the human, cultural, or maybe even psychological sides of business. I mean, it's 2018, so I think it's now, with the new ISO 31000 coming out last month, I think it's now kind of a given that risk management is perceived also as a decision-making tool or as an integral part of core business processes or activities, if we're kind of using the ISO language. So risk is part of something, as opposed to risk for the sake of doing risk management. And as soon as you kind of say that first part of the sentence, then immediately the second part of the sentence is, well, if risk management is part of somebody's baggage of decision-making tools, or if it's part of integrated into some sort of processes, you immediately are faced with a person who's making that decision, who has been making that decision for 20, 30 years, or CFO who's been budgeting in a particular way for a decade, or head of procurement who's been procuring goods, or head of investment who's been investing in a particular way for years. So clearly there's a huge human component, and I think you've specifically kind of tried to pinpoint on that. What are you doing in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. The idea is to, when we talk about decisions around risk, or just generally decisions, for me, I sort of talk about the fact that as a risk manager, I don't manage any risk. I'm about, to your point, making sure that the person who is making the decisions is doing so in full knowledge, or in the best available information. And so yes, they may have been making those decisions for years and years and years, but have they kept pace with the fact that their environment has changed, their organisation has changed, the external environment's changed, and are still making the best decisions for the organisation? And so quite often it's about talking about to the individual, what is it that you're trying to achieve? How do I help you achieve your objectives? Whether it's higher investment returns, meeting budgets, producing goods and services on time, and all those sorts of things. And at the end of the day, it's their risk appetite around them achieving their objectives. And so I can have that conversation, and I can bring different perspectives. I can bring different tools, analyses, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it's driving that empowerment and accountability into the business and into where the people are making the decisions, and making sure they're just applying good common sense.
That's interesting. I mean, there are two people who kind of started the conversation around those lines. Hans Liso, the ex-CRO of Lego, calls it informed risk-taking.
Yes.
That's what essentially risk management should be all about, is informing the decision makers about what risk they should be taking, and what risks, how much of that risk they are in fact taking. And Norman Marks, who's obviously a thought leader in risk space in US, he always talks about not about managing risks, but helping companies achieve success, or helping executives achieve success. We actually had a very interesting conversation with Hans on that topic, is that helping executives achieve a success may not equal helping the company achieve that success, because individual goals may and usually do significantly vary from the corporate overall objectives. And risk manager kind of slotting into any of those. In fact, he's probably going to be more successful if he's helping an individual as opposed to the overall company. But I'm interested in sort of picking up on that human side. What were some of the examples that kind of worked really nicely, where people got engaged, or they started listening, or even allowed use the risk manager to kind of see things, so you would be able to comment? For example, for me, it took, and I'm not exaggerating, it took me a year to get access, uninterrupted access to the strategic financial model of the company. So the CFO would send me basically that huge Excel file with all the secrets and all the interesting information. So I was actually able to run scenarios on that and apply Monte Carlo simulation to that file. I mean, it took a year of convincing why do we need a risk perspective on something that was already kind of done deal almost.
Yeah, wow. I mean, I think for me, and so I've been at icare now for 2.5 years. I mean, icare was only set up 2 months before I joined, so I came into a very new organisation as a CEO, a new CEO. Most of the executive team were new, the board was new, and so I think there probably wasn't that history or those sort of embedded behaviours that I had to break. And I think for me it was important to come into the organisation and show what value I could add to the organisation, and not just as a CRO, but as someone on the executive team, and as I say, working with my fellow executives and the board to develop the first strategy for icare. Where were we going to take the organisation over the next 3 to 5 years, and really earn that trust and show that I had the best interests of the organisation and the individuals at heart. And then started to have the conversations and say, well, look, one of my 2 hats that I wear is to help you, the executive, to achieve your objectives. The other hat I wear is providing assurances to our board and to our audit and risk committee that we as management are running the place well. And so I think, maybe it was just good luck, but I certainly, that resonated with people. And so I was able to get into their diaries, have those conversations, and really start to find, look for ways in which I could add value to them and help them and support them. And so, I've never really had those sort of barriers or, no, we can't give you this. I think I've been quite fortunate in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's what risk management is all about. You are fortunate in some ways, and then there are other challenges, and you just have to kind of go where the flow takes you. So, we can technically integrate risk management into any kind of decision, but people don't really want us in some decisions immediately. So you have to first build trust by changing some of the decisions, and then you then kind of expand. But you said something very interesting. You call it 2 hats. I call it 2 risk managements. I'm probably a little bit more cynical in that. Is that there is the risk management for the board and the regulators and the external auditors and financial institutions and everything else, everybody else, the shareholders. And there's the risk management, kind of the second risk management for the decision makers. And what I have found, at least up to now, is that those 2 things may be completely separate. So, for example, the regulators, the board members, they still want to see risk registers or some sort of risk reports, like risk appetite statements, for example. The regulator wants to see a risk appetite statement. Decision makers probably don't really care much about risk appetite statements. They would find the same thing, but in a much more useful form. Have you found that much difference?
I have, and certainly, my previous role where I wasn't an APRA regulated entity, and now at icare where we're not APRA regulated because we're a government agency. But I think, there have been situations where, I've produced a risk management strategy document that was deliberately aimed at the employees of the organisation. So I wanted something short, plain language, not too much detail, and just make sure it was readable. And the board said, yes, that's a great document for engaging your staff and your organisation. We just thought it would be longer. And so then I had to write more of a risk management handbook that had all of the detail. It was 30 or 40 pages long, because that's what the board wanted to see. So, absolutely, I've seen that. I think, where you can get away with it, or where you can integrate the 2 and you aren't having to double handle pieces of work, the better. But I think, still, reflecting on the fact that you have 2 different audiences for 2 different purposes. So, for me, it's about educating the board and making sure that they don't get too far down into the management issues and operational decisions and those sorts of things. So we're keeping them abreast of all of the major material issues, and also what we're doing about them and how we're monitoring and measuring and remediating those risks. Whereas within the organisation, it's more of that management risk. So sometimes it can be quite different because different purposes, different audiences, different expectations, different levels of materiality. So.
And have you tried integrating risk management into the actual decision-making process, where by applying risk analysis, you actually change how the kind of decision, for example, that sounds like you've integrated into strategic planning. So you've added components of risk analysis along the way, so the end result is probably different to what it could have been if no risk analysis was integrated. What did you do? What tools did you use? Methodology, I mean.
Yeah, I think for icare, because we're say very, very different. We're not financially focused, so a lot of the analysis has actually been qualitative rather than quantitative, because at the end of the day, we're trying to provide insurance and care services to the people and businesses of New South Wales, and do that in a cost-effective way. And one of the main sort of, I guess, products that we provide is workers' compensation insurance, and that's a challenge because the people paying the premiums are employers, and the people that get the benefits are the injured workers, and so you've got to try and balance those two different customer segments. And so a lot of the conversations are more about taking that holistic view and making sure that when we're talking about customers, we've actually got both customer sets in mind, and we're, I guess, uncovering what might be a benefit to one that could be, a detriment to the other. So there's probably not any specific examples where I've said we've done something completely different, but we've perhaps done it in a different way. We've built in more checks and balances or controls, or done things in a slightly different way. Perhaps we're designing something for injured workers, and we've then gone out and actually talked to the employers and say, well, what do you think about what we're doing over here? And getting that customer centricity in place. So it's say back to your point about making informed risk decisions.
Yeah. And what about again, coming back to your risk strategy and the human side of things? What you've now kind of had an opportunity to probably implement some of the ideas. What worked? What didn't work? And I mean, we are the honest conversation, so we're trying to be pretty pragmatic about not everything works. I mean, I know by heart that I've tried to teach a lot of people, and I try to change their perspective and their behaviors. And the best you can kind of hope for as the CRO is you win some of the time with some of the people. And I mean, I've even had a lot of investment directors, friends of mine, who were decent good people, and on one project they were fully comprehensive and understanding the risks and talking and honest about it, and then immediately the next day on a different project, because some of the cognitive biases kicked in and they had some vested interest in that, suddenly they completely forgot everything they've ever learned about risk management. So humans are very predictably irrational and very volatile as well. Like, you can't just because you've taught them something doesn't mean that they will not do the opposite tomorrow. So how was that for you? Like, what worked, what didn't work?
I think the thing that's worked for us at icare is being very clear on our purpose. So we have a little one-pager called icare on a page, and it has our vision and our mission, our values, and what we call our DNA, which was that sort of commercial mind, social heart, and balancing those two perspectives. And so that provides clarity around, what we're here to do is to essentially provide world-class services to the people and businesses of New South Wales. That's our why. I don't know if you've read Simon Sinek and his book Start With Why, and he has something called the golden circle, which is you start with why in the middle, and then the what and the how. And what he says is a lot of organisations start with what they sell, and then how that might benefit you, and they don't start with the why. But if you start there, the what and the how are aligned, and it becomes a lot easier to articulate, communicate, and understand. And I think for icare that's been very important, is to bring everybody literally onto one page. And so when you're having a conversation across the business, we can talk about, well, hang on, is this providing world-class services to our customers, and which customers are we talking about? And so I think the more that people are aligned, because people don't turn up to work to do a bad job, and I think where people's performance doesn't meet expectations is where there's that misalignment of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So that's been hugely useful. I think the other thing for icare is just the fact that we have deliberately focused on the culture of the organisation, very people-centred. We use human-centred design in a lot of approaches to both our internal projects and our external projects. So again, just driving that people-centricity, understanding that, yes, to your point, we're all different, and what we need to do is provide products and services that are fit for purpose purpose, not a one-size-fits-all. And so I've taken that approach to risk management and said, we can't have one risk management framework that is going to suit everybody, and we need to go out there and talk to our internal customers and work out what's fit for purpose for them. And whether that's sitting in on their risk management working group meetings, whether that's providing them with some analysis, some decision-making tools, whether that's presenting to their staff about what we do within risk management, just finding out where we can add value. I think what hasn't worked, one of the things I've have been quite vocal about is that I hate heat maps. To me,
that's a surprise.
Reporting, especially, and to your point earlier, we put one in our board reporting because they want to see a heat map.
Yeah.
But the fact that you've got 12 discrete points on a grid, where in fact, as we know, the world's a complex place and all of those risks are interconnected.
Yeah.
How do you convey that message to your board? And also, coming from an actuarial background, taking a whole distribution of likelihood and severity and condensing that down
into
to
a single
one
point.
thing. Yeah, it's about destruction of information.
Silly, to put the least. Yeah. And just a point to our listeners, in case you didn't get the memo, there's the research which is called The Risk of Using Risk Matrices, and it's written by 2 American scientists and 1 Swedish one. And as a risk manager, I think it's your moral obligation to read that research and know what kind of rubbish you're putting in your reports. And hopefully some of you will be embarrassed enough to stop using them unless you really, really have to because the regulators are asking, because there is a better way of communicating risk information.
Yeah, and I gave a presentation last year on the risk of risk management and talked about some of those things, and even thinking about running a risk workshop, and quite often you just get the people who turn up because you provide free food at morning tea time or free coffee, and then you think about people's biases and heuristics. Having 10 people in the room, you might not get 10 different views. You just get the view of the loudest person or the most senior person or the person that's still awake, and so again, thinking about and challenging your own biases and thoughts around risk management, and that's something I think I've tried to do. Obviously reading things that are posted on LinkedIn, yourself included, and attending conferences and just engaging in sort of unstructured conversations with people, and I've found that a hugely beneficial way, because you start to challenge your own beliefs and thoughts, and to hear that other people are doing different things, and then sort of saying, that might work for icare. How do I now embed that within our organisation?
And again, in case you didn't get the second memo, there's apparently a whole area of research which is called risk perception, and it's used in neuroeconomics. Basically, it's a science around how our brain works, and that field of research now has 2 Nobel Prizes in economics, in 2002 and 2017, and it's actively used by CIA. So you can tell this is serious stuff. And there are 2 other books that are must read for any risk manager who is serious about their profession. It's a book called Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, and a book called Risk Savvy by German or Austrian, I'm not sure, scientist whose last name I can never pronounce, Gogenizer, and I'm sure I've butchered his name, but this is absolutely critical research on how you think humans behave when they're faced with uncertainty and when you get a workshop or an interview together, and how their brain actually works. And it's very different. There are over 200 biases, about 20 or 30 of which influence how you qualitatively collect risk information, which put a pretty compelling business case towards the argument that many risk workshops are useless at best and detrimental to the actual decision making at worst. So it kind of it significantly impacts, and we're not even talking about hidden agendas, as most executives actually have a lot of hidden agendas and their own personal motivations and personal objectives, which kind of which not deteriorates, but it significantly complicates the risk discussion. Like going into a meeting with an executive naively thinking that he will share your passion for achieving corporate objectives and identifying and mitigating and better managing risks is just it's not real. The world operates in a slightly different matrix, it seems. But what I found, the best way to kind of ground yourself is I took my wife to one of the conferences I was running, and she kind of heard me talk about cognitive biases a lot, and I actually talked specifically about 15 of them. And now she remembered that, and she catches me every single day when I fall into those cognitive biases at home. So you need someone else on your team basically to kind of constantly remind you that you are just as human as all the other people in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean and having the psychological myth and to actually be able to call those out amongst your fellow executive members, I think, is something that we have here at icare. But I've certainly experienced other places where that doesn't happen, and so no one challenges the biases of the CEO. And then you get into things like the hero myth and those sorts of things. But I read the Daniel Kahneman book last year as part of, I did a postgraduate certificate in the psychology of risk through Australian Catholic University.
Nice.
And I found that just sort of, certainly opened my eyes and mind to, all of those things in terms of psychology of risk, biases, I think prospect theory that Daniel Kahneman wrote about, and having studied utility theory, as an undergrad in economics, and then to find out that that's almost completely wrong is quite refreshing. And so I've certainly sort of grasped those concepts and so very much taken a people-centered approach to risk management here at icare. So
that kind of really brings it home, is that you understand if you want integrating into decision making. I mean, mathematics is kind of one. You have to be able to quantify some of the risks for the more important decisions. But you also immediately realize that on the other side of the decision are humans, and they have so much going on in their heads that just having a conversation is actually not going to bring that out. You have to be clever about simply talking to a person, because his normal response is ignore risk or even hide risk, unless you can prove the benefit to him personally, unless you can disarm some of his cognitive biases by using the right words and even using the right colors. It's all much more scientific, it seems, than what we kind of believed for the many years.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the other, story that springs to mind, and for Australian listeners, they will have heard of a guy by the name of Nick Farr-Jones, who was a captain of the Wallabies rugby team back in the late 80s, early 90s. He came and did a presentation to us at icare a few weeks ago, and one of his major sort of takeouts was, focus on the game, not the scoreboard. And in a corporate sense, what I took that to mean is don't focus on your metrics. Focus on what you're doing, and the metrics will take care of themselves. And I think a few CEOs have gone even further, and I think Richard Branson is very much the look after your employees, and they will look after your customers. And I'm a great believer in that. You can't expect your employees to treat your customers well if you don't treat your employees well. And you need to think about that and be driven by what's going on within the organisation, not just the metrics that fall out the back end of your reporting. So.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you've mentioned before we started that you now have another hat on. As the risk manager of the year last year, you now have a wonderful task. I mean, time-consuming, but a wonderful task for the profession is you're going around and doing little road shows. What are some of the key messages? What are some of the important messages that you're sharing with the risk managers in the country?
Sure. Yeah, well, so part of the, as you said, winning the Risk Manager of the Year awards through the RMIA is to do this roadshow. So we presented in Sydney last week, and then we'll be presenting in the other major cities around Australia later in the year, and Singapore and New Zealand. And for me, it's part of it's about just telling the story about icare and what I found when I came here, which was a lot of empty seats. I technically had a risk compliance and audit team reporting to me. In reality, I had two people and two permanent employees and a contractor. So there's a lot of just building up the icare framework, but also the approach that we've taken, which is just sort of, as we've talked about through the course of this conversation, that very much that people focus, and are we making the right decisions? Talking about psychological safety, courage is one of our values within icare. So have the courage to challenge the status quo, have the courage to call out if something is not in the best interests of our customers, but also have the courage to put your hand up when things go wrong so that we can learn from that. So there's a lot of those sorts of conversations, and sort of we've used a construct called the Johnson and Scholes cultural web as a way to articulate, you know, the culture that we would like to see at icare, and then to sort of, I guess, measure how far away we are from that, and then what steps we need to take to better improve our culture. What else have we talked about? I mean, I talked a little bit about the where to from here in terms of my own thinking around risk management, and one of them is very much along those lines of, you know, how do we continue to evolve our thinking around risk management from that psychology and sociology perspective? So how do individuals think, and then how do people interact? And I think you know, as robots get more robotic, do more of the menial tasks, I think humans have got to become more human, and you know, so then we get to the point where just, you know, a bunch of humans talking to each other. So do we have the right skills, abilities, and also understand, as you said earlier, the biases and heuristics that people come to the table with, and to have this naivety that everyone's going to think the same way and look after the best interests of the organisation. If they're not, then, you know, that's an undisclosed risk. So yeah, a lot of talk about that, and generally just getting out and meeting people, I think, is fantastic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I also, within Sydney, have set up a little group on LinkedIn called the Sydney Risk Professionals. And that was really, you know, I just had posted something on LinkedIn and said, is there anyone interested in getting together for just sort of unstructured conversations? I mean, there's enough conferences you can go to and roundtables and workshops run by consultants and things. And I just thought, well, as a completely different forum, just getting people in a room that just want to talk about risk management. Course, and so we've now got, I think, just over 300 people on that group, and we meet probably once every 2 or 3 months, and you know, pick a topic and get someone in and have a chat, and then have a, you know, a bit of a Q&A session. And you know, we had the program director from the Psychology of Risk course from ACU come last time. We also had a guy, and actually another piece of interesting thinking I'm doing is around how you get risk management and innovation into the same kind of conversation. And so I had a guy by the name of Peter Brad, who's the CEO of a little company called the Beanstalk Factory, and he's about trying to incite innovation by individuals within large corporates and ASX listed companies. And so getting him in to sort of talk from an innovation perspective, and where he's sort of run into problems with, you know, the traditional chief risk officer, or sometimes, as he put it, the chief no risk officer. And that, you know, certainly if you look at the old ISO 31000 standard, where it's all about identifying and draw, you know, I guess removing uncertainty, you know, you don't get anything much more uncertain than trying something new and different, or something innovative. So to me, you know, from a risk management perspective, you've almost got to have two different approaches. One is, how do you manage the risks associated with the value that exists in your business as usual activity? But then quite separately, how do you fit risk around a desire or a need to innovate within your organisation? And they're two different constructs. And if you try and do everything under a 31,000 standard or approach, you run into problems, and, you know, I think you can easily drive innovation out of an organisation. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, luckily, I think the new version is so broad that you can literally do anything. It doesn't restrict you to any particular process. And it does, for the first time ever, it does say that any given organization should and could have multiple processes, multiple algorithms for risk management. I, in fact, had 5 different risk management processes in the company where I worked. One for different kinds of decision making, and one for budgeting, one for strategic planning, one for procurement, and 2 for different investments. And there were completely different methodologies, different tools, even different logics. So that's interesting. But you did mention something that kind of stuck in my mind, is courage being one of the important values. I've probably 6 months or so ago, I've written an article because I just got so sick of hearing excuses. I wrote an article which said, why are risk managers scared of taking risks? Or are risk managers scared of taking risks? Because as risk managers, I mean, many up to now, which is kind of bizarre, I think it's suicidal for their career to kind of stick to the traditional risk workshops and risk register updates. I mean, in many companies, risk management is still all about your quarterly or monthly, your annual updates of the risk register and creating an updated risk report. I mean, surely there's more to risk management. I mean, not sure. We know that there's more to risk management than that, because the scariest thing I hear when I do executive education is that an executive sitting there listening to to our discussion on risk, and I do a lot on cognitive biases, and he goes, like, that makes sense. But more importantly, I've just signed like a multi-million-dollar contract. Where was your risk management? Because just now I've taken on a couple of million of extra risk on our books. And where was risk management then? Well, they were busy preparing for the next quarterly risk workshop. Yes. So they weren't there. And then by the time the risk workshop comes, all the risk already has been taken. It's already on balance sheet. There's all you can do is kind of go, okay, well, that seems red, which is not very helpful, surely. Yeah. But why risk managers don't have the courage to kind of make that first step and come to the executives and say, well, why don't we try something else? Why don't we kind of keep the quarterly stuff for the board and spend 20% time on that, but why don't we spend 80% of our time, of our team's time, on something that is actually useful for you as the decision makers? For example, you're just about to make an investment in the new technology. Surely that's a pretty risky activity. Do you want us to do some analysis on that, some scenarios? Or the budget is about to be signed off. Do you want to know the probability of meeting that budget next year and what the liquidity gap may be with some confidence interval? Why don't many risk managers have that courage?
You're probably talking to the wrong one, because I absolutely agree. I mean, I think risk managers potentially, spend a lot of time certainly down in those operational risks and risk reporting and the stuff that gets seen by the board but is not important to the running of the organisation and making the right decisions. So certainly that's something that we've continued to focus on at icare. Going and talking to our enterprise project management office and say, how do we help you and your project managers to articulate, identify and mitigate risk better? Spend a lot of time in there, and certainly as little time as possible actually on the reporting of what's already happened or what we've already got under control. But it reminds me of a series of books I've read, the Freakonomics books. And there was one particular story in there that I liked, and it revolves a football player and taking a goal kick. But I guess the key message I took out of that is that sometimes people do things to be seen to be doing something, or so that they don't look like an idiot, rather than what's best for the organisation or the sports team in this case. And so I've challenged my guys and said sometimes the best thing to do as a risk manager is get out of the way. If the organisation is making the right decisions, informed risk decisions, it's getting on and doing things, yes, that doesn't stop issues arising and incidents happening. But if we can move forward from those, learn, change tack, and achieve the same result, isn't that a better thing than us, slowing the process down to, require a risk workshop to then come up with a risk register that sits on the shelf and no one reads or
Well, and it's interesting you say that, because if you kind of still think in the paradigm that to do risk management, a risk workshop has to happen and it has to be recorded in the form of a risk register, that immediately kind of tells you, well, that will take too much time. If a decision has to be made next week, it's a multi-million-dollar investment decision that has to be made next week. There's no time for a workshop. There's no time for putting together a risk register and discussing a risk register. And that's why I've discovered, and not just myself, but many people I think are beginning to discover, is that when you do risk management for the sake of risk management, the workshops and the risk registers are useful because that's what people expect to see. In fact, some board members may even ask, or external auditors may ask, when was the last time you've ran a workshop? Where's your risk register? But when you try and integrate risk into the decision making, the tools that you use are actually different. And I always say that there are ultimately 5 tools that we use, not for the corporate governance stuff, which is, to me, is not that interesting, because I can pull a risk register in 5 minutes in my cabin, in my office. I don't even have to talk to anyone. But the actual decision-making risk management is, there are decision trees, which are actually interesting because they've been around since 1970s and they're actively used by decision-making professionals. And they're actually very powerful tools to both combat cognitive biases and quantify some of the different scenarios in risk. Sensitivity analysis, scenario analysis, which is again interesting because finance is actually using that. Every single CFO uses sensitivity and scenarios. It's a given. Any budget will have optimistic, pessimistic. That is risk management.
Yes.
Now, what I have also discovered is that I think risk managers have to just gently double check, because what I have found is that when I looked at this, my old CFO's scenarios, I found that he purposefully excluded a lot of very important assumptions to make sure everything still looks fine, although it wasn't. And when we started doing our scenarios, his pessimistic scenario was like twice as good as our optimistic scenario.
Wow!
So there was a big gap in this in reality. And then the fourth tool is Monte Carlo simulations, which are, if you've seen any of my kind of articles, I'm a big fan of. Because it just highlights the distribution as opposed to a single value point estimates. And that's that I found to be a pretty powerful conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, having that conversation not about what your expected outcome is, but what's the uncertainty and the variability around that, and what if that is within appetite and what's not. And certainly coming from an actuarial background, I've built a few Monte Carlo simulations in my time, and I think that's that is a great tool to enable the right conversation, which is around where does my uncertainty lie? What might happen? Things could be better than expected, but they could also be worse. And so then you can, from that conversation, is obviously, how do we I guess make sure that what needs to go right does, as well as what could go wrong and how do we mitigate that.
And that immediately, I mean, there's a lot of questions that I receive, like what about risks and opportunities, and how do you differentiate, and like how do you some people come up with crazy things like they have a heat map on risks and a heat map on opportunities side by side. I mean, that is a pretty clear sign of insanity. And that's why I like simulations, is because they show you the full distribution. You immediately know what is under threat and what is your upside, what is your opportunity. And it kind of answers that question automatically. You don't have to separately think about what are our opportunities, what are our threats, because it's all in one single picture. I was fascinated once, because when I first presented Monte Carlo outcomes to the CEO, and I was lucky. He hated heat maps, like because he constantly was saying like, "Why are you showing me picture in time? Like, why is that point? I need to see the movement or something." Like he couldn't quite place it, but he was constantly saying, "Why are you showing me a picture? I want to see a movie." I couldn't really figure out what that meant, and it could have meant something different, but I think he wanted something more than just a single point estimate.
And that's my thinking around that. I've had similar conversations, and it raises two issues. One is around timeframes. So I think the movie thing is what does it look like over time? And so if I'm doing a 1-year business plan, a 3-year strategic plan, and my longer, third horizon sort of thinking, those risks might look quite different and have different impacts over those 3 time horizons. And then the other thing that's interesting is that I think a lot of risk managers and risk management approaches assume a steady state and sort of what are my risks relative to where I sit today. Whereas, I think you should be looking at, risks relative to where I want to be in 1, 3 or 5 years' time. Because, if you're staying still and your competitors are moving forward, then relatively you're going backwards. Or if you don't achieve what you want to achieve in the next 5 years, then as the CEO you might lose your job. You certainly won't get your bonus. So it's not about that relative to today. It's relative to where you want to be, and that I guess, or I think, hopefully removes one of those biases, which is around status quo. The resistance to change because you just want to preserve what you've got. And if that's expected year on year on year, well, good luck, or you're in a fantastic job with very little risk. But most organisations want to improve, and so you need to talk about the risks relative to that forward-looking view. And I think sometimes risk management doesn't quite keep track with that. So.
And I think in a way scenarios and simulations help to address that, because they show you what the liquidity will look like in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time. And basically, and that's why I like scenarios and simulations, because it changes the conversation from discussing the top 10 risks to discussing what's the cash in bank or NPV or some other future business metric will look like with risks in mind. And that's a very different conversation. I mean, I would come to the board meeting and I would say, that's a wonderful strategy. There's a 3% chance of meeting it.
Yes.
Which means there's a 97% chance the strategy will not be achieved. And I can actually, within 95 confidence interval, I can actually tell you by how much it will be missed. And that's a very different conversation. I've just explained the whole risk report without ever mentioning a single word risk. And that somehow resonated with some, I guess not with all. I mean, I did get feedback that some of the guys in the Ministry of Finance didn't get it after we've presented it. But you can't really win all the time, I guess.
Sure. Yeah. No, it's certainly an interesting field to operate in, and I think as we've just discussed, I mean, the thinking of the past it needs to stay in the past, and we need to innovate as risk managers, and as you say, have the courage to try new things, to take a different approach, and say to sometimes sort of just keep out of the way, focus on the things that are important, not just the things that people expect you to see you doing. And the other thing I think is have fun while you're doing it. I mean, one of the things, I don't know if you saw on my LinkedIn profile, but my unofficial title is Chief Risky Dude.
I did see.
I've been caught playing Santa Claus at our corporate events and things like that. And I think that's part of it as well, is that risk management and just generally businesses, people want to have fun, and so how do you inject a bit of fun into what you're doing as well? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's a good ending thought to whatever you do in risk. Do have fun. And I was going to say something else, but it was too sinister, so I'm not going to. I'll save it for another video somewhere, next to the sea. Thank you so much, Gavin, for having this time to come to talk to me about risk. And thank you, I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.